All right. Today is Palm Sunday, but I thought we don't often get a chance to talk and think about the story of Jesus' Passion. It's also called Passion Sunday. And Passion is the term they use for the story of Jesus between kind of Palm Sunday now and then his Passion is usually kind of from the Last Supper to on the cross. So I wanted to just read part of that to you, the story after Jesus is kind of already been tried and convicted and going to be put on the cross. The soldiers assigned to the governor took Jesus into the governor's palace and got the entire brigade together for some fun. They stripped him and dressed him in a red toga. They placed a crown from branches of a thorn bush and set it on his head. They put a stick in his right hand for a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mocking reverence. "Bravo, King of the Jews," they said. "Bravo." Then they spit on him and hit him on the head with a stick. When they had had their fun, they took off the toga and put his own clothes back on him. Then they proceeded out to the crucifixion. Along the way, they came a man from Cyrene named Simon and made him carry Jesus' cross. Arriving at Golgotha, a place they called Skull Hill, they offered him a mild painkiller, which was a mixture of wine and myrrh. But when he tasted it, he wouldn't drink it. After they had finished nailing him to the cross and were waiting for him to die, they whiled away the time by throwing dice for his clothes. Above his head they had posted a criminal charge against him. "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Along with him they also crucified two criminals, one to his right, the other to his left. People passing along the road jeered, shaking their heads in mock lament. "You bragged that you could tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. So show us your stuff and save yourself. If you're really God's son, come down from that cross." The high priest, along with the religion scholars and leaders, were right there mixing it up with the rest of them, having a great time poking fun at him. He saved others. He can't save himself. King of Israel is he? Then let him get down from that cross. We'll all become believers then. He did claim to be God's son, didn't he? Even the two criminals who crucified next to him joined in the mockery. From noon to 3 the whole earth was dark. Around mid-afternoon Jesus groaned out of the depths, crying loudly, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Some bystanders who heard him said, "He is calling for Elijah." One of them ran and got a sponge soaked in sour wine and lifted it on a stick so he could drink. The others joked, "Don't be in such a hurry. Let's see if Elijah comes and saves him." But Jesus, again crying out loudly, breathed his last. At that moment, the temple curtain was ripped in two, top to bottom. There was an earthquake, and rocks were split in pieces. What's more, tombs were opened up, and many bodies of believers asleep in their graves were raised. After Jesus' resurrection, they left the tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. The captain of the guard and those with him, when they saw the earthquake and everything else that was happening, were scared to death. And they said, "This has to be the Son of God." The word of God for the people of God. May the Spirit add a blessing to our understanding of it. The last couple of Group 316 meetings, one of the last couple, and a little bit of confirmation, we talked about why Jesus had to die. We believe that Jesus was truly God and he came, and why did he have to die that way? That's a question that has been asked probably since it happened. And there are lots of answers, but it's always kind of been puzzling to me to think why God set the whole system up the way God did. From creation to the cross to now, why set it up that way? So you have to send your son to be treated in such a way, to be tortured and eventually nailed to a cross. Executed, I suppose, Roman style. While I don't have an answer to why God set things up that way, I do want us to think about why Jesus died. Let's picture the scenes surrounding the death of Jesus. The look of innocence as he was betrayed and arrested. The sadness at his face as he stood listening to a crowd shout, "Crucify him," which only a few days earlier had shouted, "Hosanna." Or picture the pain on his face as he hung on that cross. The reason why Jesus was there was because of you and me. He was there for you and me. Jesus wanted and needed to bring about a restoration between us and God. You see, I think we enter this holiday season and we're quick to treat it like any other season. We look back and we're thankful for the cross, and we become so used to the idea that Jesus died for us that I think sometimes it doesn't have the impact on our lives that it should. The fact that Jesus did die for us should impact us deep down and penetrate to our hearts. That place was Jerusalem. It's the time of the Passover when Jesus' own people were coming together to remember God's delivery of them from slavery in Egypt. That day he rides in on that Sunday as a king. People recognizing him and hoping that he is a king that's going to save them and deliver them. But very quickly they realize that he isn't a king that they hoped he would be. And that disappointment leads to shouts of crucify him. So Jesus is brought before the power of the day. Caiaphas, the high priest, and Pilate, the governor. And eventually he's found guilty of blasphemy. So if you want the historical reason for why Jesus was killed, it's because Jesus represented something more powerful. He represented hope. And Rome didn't want that little territory of Jerusalem to become a nuisance. So anyone that came to inspire hope and maybe kind of built up a following and could be a little bit of trouble, they wanted to squash right away. The religious leaders thought he was preaching heresy by claiming to be the Son of God. So they were worried about their power being taken. So a writer, Richard Swanson, says the empire, meaning Rome, is not seeking to simply crucify one man, whether gentle or troublesome. They want to seek that, though it may take a lifetime, it will catch and kill anyone who stirs Jewish hope. So the historical reason Jesus is killed is because he was making a little bit too much trouble for Rome and the religious leaders of the time. But why did Jesus die from a spiritual, religious standpoint? Marcus Borg, who is a great writer about all things, lots of things about Jesus, points out the uniqueness of Christianity, whose founder was executed by the established authority of the day. And Borg responds by saying he was executed because, he died. He offers several interpretations, and I say one is his death was a consequence, like I said, the historical reason for what he was doing. He probably knew if he kept upsetting the religious leaders and kept kind of a big following of him, he knew it could have some bad consequences for him. But another reason that Jesus died, because he shows us a path as Christians. Kind of as a way of dying to an old way and being raised again to a new way of being. Jesus talked a lot about that. Give up yourself and follow God. Die to your old way of thinking and be reborn again to the new way of thinking. And we can all see in the death of Jesus or the depth of God's love for us. And the final reason, or a final reason for the death of Jesus is maybe the hardest one. And that's the sacrificial understanding of why Jesus had to die. Some talk about it being a ransom to pay our debt to God. For when we sin, the punishment of sin is death. But Jesus' death took our place on the cross. And I'll admit I have trouble with that because I don't like that vision of sacrifice and ransom. But that's the way God had it set up. The Jewish people would seek forgiveness by coming to the temple and offering animals for sacrifice or having the priest sacrifice for them. So in essence, Jesus came and was our sacrifice for us. The earliest Christians would have understood that in laying down his own life, Jesus denied the temple's claim to have the monopoly on forgiveness and access to God. God in Jesus had already provided a sacrifice and thus taken care of whatever we think separates us from God. So everything was changed after Jesus died and was raised again. God's love is revealed in it. The world was a different place. You don't have to come to me anymore. I will come to where you are, Jesus was saying. We don't have to sacrifice in a temple anymore. I've sacrificed for you. I'm where you need to be. So that message, that sacrifice, that death on the cross, that execution, if you will, that Jesus suffered, is something I think we don't think about enough. We tend to jump straight from Palm Sunday to Easter. We forget about that tremendous sacrifice that Jesus did make. The Oxford Dictionary defines sacrifice as an act of giving up something one values for the sake of something else that is of greater importance. Jesus' life was a sacrifice. He gave up the glory of heaven. He gave up human comforts to reach the lost. He gave up popularity and acceptance to share the truth. He gave up his rights to accomplish a greater good. And he gave up everything to reach those who needed him the most. And more importantly, or most importantly maybe, he gave up his life so we could keep ours. You see, I think Jesus had to die to demonstrate God's love for us. Our sin separates us from God. And the only way to get that back was through a sacrifice. And Jesus made that sacrifice. And he bridges that gap between us and God that our sin creates. Sin destroyed our relationship with God. Jesus helps repair that relationship. But I think our challenge is to think about, as we learn or as we travel during this week and we are reminded of Jesus' death on that cross, the pain that he endured at the hand of religious leaders, the despair and the total abandonment he felt by his disciples, and even as he felt on the cross wondering if God had left him. He did all of that for us. How does that impact our lives? Do we live a life that reflects enough gratitude for the sacrifices Jesus made for us? And that gift of repairing a relationship with God, is that a gift that we fully accept and that our lives reflect in giving? Jesus has given us a precious and marvelous gift that we may never fully be able to understand. He has offered us life by the means of his death and his resurrection. Jesus gave himself to buy us back from the darkness of sin and death. He paid for it all. He paid for the time that we lied to our wives, our families. He paid for the time we used our words to hurt instead of help. He paid for the time when we cursed God's name in anger. And he paid for the time that we took what did not belong to us. He paid for all the times that we sinned. He paid for every time that we turn our back on God. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 20, Jesus says that he is going to die, but he also says something else at the end of that verse. On the third day he will be raised to life. So that death and that sacrifice and that execution of Jesus gives us something else. Hope. Because on that third day he was raised again. He gave his life as an act of love, an act of sacrifice, and an act of redemption. The blood he gave was the ultimate donation to the existence of us. So Jesus has given us that precious gift. The question is, what are we doing with it?